So, Saxon, welcome to Portugal. Bem-vindo. It's really nice to actually meet you. I mean, I know we've spoken on the phone a bit in the past, but yeah, it's really great to meet you because I've known your name for like a long time as a leading American garden photographer. But I understand you did a degree in history, so how come you got into gardening and plants and landscape?
Well, I've always loved gardening.
Yeah, yeah.
My family my parents were both gardeners.
Yeah, yeah.
And as a lad, I had to do garden chores.
Yes.
Cut the grass, weed, pick the beans, those sort of things.
Yeah, yeah.
And I realized I had an affinity for it.
Yes,
and I always had a little garden wherever I was at university and afterwards. And I pursued a professional career of photography.
Right.
I moved from Virginia on the east coast of the United States to California.
Yeah.
And became an apprentice with a master commercial photographer.
Yeah.
And spent 4 years learning the trade, started my own business as a commercial photographer, and realized after a while I didn't like commercial photography. I didn't like being indoors all the time and the whole idea of marketing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I had a garden, and I always loved a garden, but I didn't realize there was any official trade publications.
Right, yeah, yeah.
I had a friend who lived across this next neighborhood when we lived in San Francisco, who had a back porch and a begonia growing on it, and she one day said, "You must come see this begonia. It's lovely, and it's the same as this picture in a magazine."
Yeah.
I'd never seen a gardening magazine.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah, yeah.
And I saw the picture, and she was so proud.
Yeah.
She grew it just as well as the photograph.
Yeah, yeah.
But for me, one of those literal light bulbs goes off in my head. So, there's garden magazines.
Yes.
There's what I call book learning about gardening, because I'd always learned it by doing.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was at a crossroads in my own career. I really was not liking the commercial photography. And when I was in the university, I was a photojournalist with a newspaper. So I suddenly realized, oh, there's an industry about gardening, and I immediately began trying to figure a way to get into it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And how did you get into it? Because I mean, this must have been at a time when garden media in the States was probably still quite undeveloped in some ways.
Somewhat, but there was a fairly large industry of sort of the how-to books.
Yes.
In San Francisco, where I was living, was Ortho. At that point, a division of Chevron, a huge corporation, and they had a large line of gardening books.
Yes.
And they hired freelancers to do their books. And I so well remember going to show them my photos, looking to try to break in. And I had deliberately chosen to only show photos of the wildflowers that I had investigated in California. Normally, as a commercial photographer, you approach a new client saying, "Oh, I can do portraits, I can do computers, I can do any number of things." And I chose just to show them my private photos of flowers. And fortunately, they nodded politely and said, "Yes, we'll give you a call." But they actually did within a few months. And I did my first, in retrospect, sort of odd book titled. It was called All About Camellias, Rhododendrons, and Azaleas. One little thin book about all these, but it was an introduction to me about the whole industry. And also in Northern California was Sunset Books. And Sunset Books was also doing a similar line of how-to books. And they had a magazine, which at that time was very robust with the garden stories. These days, sadly, the amount of coverage with gardens is virtually negligible. But at that time, there was a large garden industry in publications. And I was able to tap into that as a professional photographer. And that gave me a leg up. And at that time, there were some good garden writers in the trade in the U.S., not to compare to the British industry, which is much more elevated and sophisticated. But none of the writers were any good with photography. So I had a big leg up and had all the work I could do for years.
Were there any particular writers you formed a sort of working relationship with or were able to coordinate with?
At that time, no, because I was working through mostly, I must have done 15 or 20 books between those two publishers, Sunset and Ortho. And there were some others. NK Lawn and Garden came up with a series, and I became well known as someone who could produce on time. That's one of the professional things you need to do, as we all know.
Oh dear, yes. Yeah. And you have a real advantage over those people who surprisingly don't do this.
No,
Yes,
they're much more casual about it, but this is a business. And so I had learned that professionally. But every book I did, there was a different writer. Not everyone, but they were not the garden writers that I've come to admire today that are passionate about gardening. These were professional writers, and they would do their research and they could write well, but it didn't quite have the lyricism and the passion that the garden writers have. And it's one reason actually I still enjoy working with writers more than architects and designers, because they tend more formulaic, and the writers tend to be more imaginative with their plant choices.
But I also understand that you began to take a real interest in California nature. I mean, you already mentioned wildflowers. I mean, California is a place with extravagant nature in many many variations. How did you get into that?
From my love of the outdoors. I think the love of gardening comes from my love of the outdoors. And when I was learning about photography as a younger man, not even thinking before I was a professional, I loved the work of Ansel Adams and the landscape photographers of the called the F64 group of black and white photography and the landscape. And I thought I could try to do that. I tried. I just don't have the patience to carry the big camera around. But I love the outdoors. And when my wife and I were courting, one of the things we love to do is go looking for wildflowers, just out on day hikes.
Oh, wow.
I would take my camera and take pictures, and she would take a wildflower book, and we'd try to identify them. We'd check them off. And so that, just the love of the flowers was part of the outdoors, and that led to the realization, there's a gardening publishing industry. And so that, and I was lucky in that I lived in San Francisco near Golden Gate Park. And the botanic garden there is quite good. And there was a man there, Dick Turner. Richard Turner was the director of horticulture at that time. He was a landscape architect and is still a friend, but he encouraged me. As I started getting a few assignments and working in the trade, and having no understanding of the West Coast horticulture and the plants, he would help me identify things. But then, again, being out in the native area, I just had that love for that, and it's only been, quite honestly, recent years, past 10, 15 years, that native plants have become very popular. There was always a niche group of native plant enthusiasts.
There's a Theodore Payne Foundation. I mean, they got going quite early, didn't they?
Yeah, they're in Southern California.
Oh, right.
I wasn't aware of, I know of their name, but I didn't know of their outreach at that time.
So, obviously, gardening and horticulture has changed, enormously over your working life. And one of those interesting things, I think, is the shift towards the interest in native plants, which is quite extraordinary all over the United States. But also that that real focus on California as having these very special habitats and very special, very rich flora, but also awareness of drought issues. And to be honest, living in the Mediterranean climate myself, looking online, I find California is the richest source of actual practical information about how you think through dealing with a summer dry climate. And fairly recently you've done this book, The Summer Dry Garden.
Yes.
That came out, a couple of years ago?
It's been about 4 years now.
4 years, yes.
But it came out after a book 20 years ago that we produced for the water district in the area that was gardening in summer dry climates.
I actually remember that. I remember seeing that actually. So you've had some interesting thoughts about how you actually define summer dry climates, or what words we use, because plant responses to lack of water are complex. They're linked to place, linked to climate, all sorts of things. Could you perhaps make those clarifications that would help us?
I could talk for the next hour. But no, it is. It's important that we're aware of climate and climate adapted plants. And I'll back up a little bit, because when I first started my career as a garden photographer was a time in the late 80s, I guess, when it was fairly lush. There was rain, was more predictable. But also the thought process of garden designers was not about summer dry climate. It was what can you do with this climate in California when it's dry all summer and there's no fungus and diseases, and you add a little bit of water, you can grow the most amazing tropical gardens.
Yes.
And that was the highest level of garden design was the lush, over-the-top tropical look. And as we went through a series of droughts, the garden designers started realizing this was not practical. As water prices went up for gardening, it became more obvious we needed to figure a way to be adapted to the climate. And I also started learning I love plants. I just love to look at them. I love to study them. I'm not a botanist or a trained person to be able to describe them accurately, but I love looking at the plants. And I realized in San Francisco particularly, there was a large movement of bringing plants from around the rest of the world, particularly from other Mediterranean, which I like to refer as summer dry climates. But that plant palette was expanding rapidly. And so I began to learn that they were better adapted. I think in recent years, the native plant people have begun to realize that the native plants are adapted to gardening as well. They're not just ecological restoration plants or just for the ecology and the environment. They're actually horticulturally valuable. And that's been changing in the past 15 years or so. So I'm not sure if that's the only. Some native plant enthusiasts think that's the only solution to gardening, and I'm very much.
You're more pragmatic.
Yes. Well, I think we're living in cities. We're living in man-made structures. We're living in human ecologies, and we need to adapt to them and whatever works with them. And most of us, and where I live, are what I call summer dry climates. And I bristle a little bit about the term Mediterranean, and I have some good-natured arguments with friends about this. But when we did the first book about 25 years ago, there was about 15 or 20 consultants we had in the field about this book and the plant selection and the name of it. And we decided on calling it Plants for Summer Dry Climates. The biggest impulse at that time was the native plant people did not want to infer that Mediterranean meant plants only from the Mediterranean. Olive trees and thyme and lavender and such, which are wonderful plants, but we did not want to limit the audience to that. So we used the term summer dry. And in the past 20 plus years of exploring that now, I realize that term Mediterranean is vastly overused and misunderstood.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think obviously I live in Portugal, which has a Mediterranean climate, but is not on the Mediterranean. But then the Mediterranean climates merge into so many other climates. I think most of Spain is not a Mediterranean country. Most of it has a steppe climate. We're onto Panayoticalides territory, really. In talking about Spain, but it is for the most part still summer dry. I mean, summer dry I agree with this, it's a very useful umbrella term. And
it's larger than Mediterranean.
Yes, much larger. And certainly in terms of my own plant selection or trialling in Portugal, I mean, I'm sort of trying to play with anything from a summer dry.
Are you using
climate.
native Portuguese plants?
We're using mostly Iberian natives, but also I've tried quite a few steppe species, which interestingly, Papaver orientale, Peters, Perovskia, interestingly, they take a very long time to establish. They don't respond as well as I thought they would. Then, of course, you get surprises like Mexican highlands salvias, which are from a summer rainfall climate. They do amazingly well. You have to try because you cannot predict accurately.
Well, I love when you have to try, and that's what gardeners do. We try and try and try, and after 3 times maybe we'll give up, but we keep trying. And I was so surprised in our book. My co-author Nora Harlow did quite a good researcher and researched plants from all over and eliminated things that weren't good or invasive. And one of the amazing plants that turns out works quite well is Camellia sazenqua, which is an Asian plant. It's from a temperate climate. It's not summer dry whatsoever. But I grow them actually in my own garden. I have a hedge of them that I started 20 some years ago, and I've realized one reason they're so successful is they bloom exactly in the winter wet season. They start blooming right about now, and they'll bloom to March, and they stop. I do need to mulch them, and I do do some watering. It's one of the issues that I want to make clear with my advocacy for summer dry climate gardening is it doesn't mean summer dry, no water gardening. I admire those that can do that, and I've met many people who are able to who totally adapt to no water. But I don't think for those of us who garden in urban areas with the changed landscape and the pavement and the heat sinks and the reflected heat and the disturbed soils can expect to do no water. And so we advocate for efficient watering plants, and that's and I think it's actually critical that we realize that we as humans living in these human ecologies of cities, we are allowed to have some of those water resources that we capture. It's not, we capture water as a civilization, not just for the farmers and not just for our toilets and cooking. We harvest that water for greenery and gardens. And so those of us who live in cities shouldn't feel guilty or penalized for using water. We should not use too much water. We shouldn't be having lawns and wasteful water practices. But if we expect to keep cities livable, they need to be green, and that requires some water, even especially in summer dry climates. And so it's a little bit of a over the years now I've been advocating for summer dry gardens. I guess 50% of the time people mean, oh, you mean no summer water, summer dry all summer. No, it's summer dry climate garden, and using efficient use of water, and plants from all over the world. So I love natives. California natives would be my first choice. But I find, as you know, South Africa, Western Australia, the Mediterranean itself, and central Chile are all summer dry climates, and we have to learn which ones are adapted. It's interesting you say here in Portugal, where your spot is, you're surprised what may or may not work. And I think it's important to understand the soils. It's so different. I've just being here in Portugal and my previous visits to Europe, the soils tend to be more rocky here than where I am in California. It's much more clay. And I understand, I've never been to Australia, the soils tend to be more sandy. And so the soils and the mineral composition of them make a huge difference in which plants are going to be adapted. And that's where it's fun in my trade and in your trade, I'm sure, of meeting people who are trying new things, unexpected successes, and and that's the future of really of our whole planet is gardeners figuring out what's going to work and make things habitable.
And in terms of photographing gardens, I mean, I have always made a point of sort of having a kind of working relationship with a photographer, and you know, I think that's very valuable for all sorts of reasons. But I've noticed there's been this trend towards photographing gardens that are terribly young, and this is one of the biggest problems. You know, because I also work as a planting designer, and I work for essentially for landscape architects doing planting. Design, and when an architect finishes a building or an artist finishes an installation or painting, it's finished and we can show it off and we can invite the press and open the champagne. With a garden, you can't. And I'm really up against it actually with this garden that was being made for the late Queen in Regent's Park in London, which is going to be open, I believe, April 2026, and what's it going to be look like when it opens? And the plants be that. So we want to plant small because smaller plants, particularly in dry, in difficult soils, establish better. It is a real frustration. There is such, I understand, there's huge pressure on photographers, on writers, on garden media. You know, people want these gardens represented. So what's your line here?
Well, fortunately, I'm in a position I don't have to do those photo shoots anymore. Once upon a time, I did work with publishers, but the other half of my income, my business, was working with designers who needed to promote their work and needed their own portfolio, and oftentimes they had a relationship with a magazine or something, and they would need photographs to help make it look good. But it almost sickens me sometimes to photograph those young gardens because they have not been sustained. And I have photographed literally $1 million gardens where truckloads of trees and large trees have been brought in, and manicured plants and overstuffed to look good, and it's just not as a gardener myself, I don't appreciate that look.
No.
And I don't want to help promote it.
No.
So I'm in a position now I don't have to.
Yes.
With my work with the Summer Dry Project, we look for gardens, at least 7 years old.
Yes.
I like them to be a generation old.
Yes.
As an example, in California, the Ruth Bancroft Garden in Walnut Creek is near to me, and it's more than 50 years old.
Yeah.
It's well established. It's a great example of what has been sustained.
Yeah.
Now, that term, sustainability, has some bit of nuance, because to be sustained, it requires maintenance.
Yes.
You don't just plant things and go away. But they look real. They have a sense. As gardeners, we know when a garden feels right.
Yes.
And that happens after a while when the plants tell you, I'm not happy with this companion, or I need to be over there. And after a few years of a garden settling in, particularly with the perennials and the smaller herbaceous plants, they need to be moved around to look right with their companions. And that doesn't happen right away, no matter how much effort and money and time is spent stuffing it to look good.
Yes.
I think that's a disservice to the real gardeners.
Yes.
It may look nice in a magazine, and for lifestyle kind of look, I can see why it's popular, but it doesn't serve gardeners.
No.
And so I fortunately, can't say I've turned down assignments, but I'm certainly not looking for them. And I'm looking for mature gardens and designers. Many designers have been around a long time. Unfortunately, once they do a project, they move on, and they have no maintenance agreement, so they have no idea what's going to happen. But I think that's a garden that has been sustained, makes it sustainable. And so that's we don't need to know how much maintenance or mulching or changing around happen, but the garden looks better when it's been sustained for a while. And I really, that's my job, is to help gardeners have success, not to show just a pretty picture.
So you mentioned the Ruth Bancroft Garden.
Yes.
What are some of your other favourite gardens? Gardens you've gone back to again and again?
Well, I go back to botanic gardens a lot, especially with my work with the Summer Dry Project.
Yes.
We had a large project for a number of years working with the state of California on I'd say the official state database of plants. It's every plant sold in California is rated by water use, and we wanted to promote the low and very low water categories and illustrate them and talk about them for their database. So with that contract, I went all around the state looking at gardens, particularly botanic gardens, to find some of the plants, and so that's important for me. And there are a number of really good botanic gardens. San Francisco is where I spent many years, has a wonderful botanic garden. Unfortunately, for success in gardeners, it's in San Francisco, which is I'd like to say a subtropical cloud forest. It's not really dry and hot in the summer, so it doesn't show success for someone who might live in an interior of the state, like Walnut Creek, where Ruth Bancroft Garden is very hot and dry. I like the Berkeley Botanic Garden, University of California Berkeley Botanic Garden is mature and it's organized around the summer dry Mediterranean climates of the world. The Huntington Botanic Garden in Southern California is exquisite. And that's because they have the budget to keep it up and the gardening staff, and it's old. It's really a great example of gardens in California. There are any number of other ones. The Leaning Pine Arboretum, which is in San Luis Obispo in the middle of the state, is a remarkable garden because it's affiliated with the university there. And a nurseryman, David Frost, had spent a number of years lecturing there and helped guide the formation of that garden. As far as private gardens, I tend to be a bit of a, dilettante perhaps. I'll see a garden one time and I've seen it. Yes. And I may want to go back in another season, but I like seeing new things. I don't really go back to the same gardens over and over. I have a few friends that I visit, but not necessarily famous or well known.
And of course, good gardens are dependent on good nurseries. And certainly the name I know that's come up again and again is Digging Dog. And I see you've got a whole gallery of digging dog images on your website. So, and we must get them in. Actually, we must get them in and interview them. So, tell me about Digging Dog.
Well, Digging Dog is the project of Gary Ratway, who's a landscape architect.
Oh, right.
And he, many years ago, 40 years ago, fell in love with a lot of the British palette of plants and would go to England regularly, yearly, and collect plants that he wanted to use in his designs.
Yes.
He's a rather successful landscape architect, does large projects, and needs a lot of plants. So as some landscape architects will do, they'll grow their own plants because they make sure they can have them when they need them. Yeah. And it turned out he grew so many plants, he had an excess. And so his wife, Deborah Wigham, and he started the nursery. It's far away. It's way up in the north coast of California. It's not anywhere near a tourist area. It's a beautiful country, but they do mostly mail order, which actually has saved them now over the years because they can sell through the mail order.
Interesting.
But they have a great palette, and he himself is a remarkable designer. His specialty is rammed earth. He goes on site and builds walls and columns out of the local soil, rammed earth. He's a remarkable designer. And so that would be one of the places I would go back to. I do go back to because he's a friend, and I just enjoy hanging out. But you mentioned the nurseries. Literally today, as we record this, I found out that the most famous nursery in our area has closed unexpectedly.
Oh, no.
Called Annie's Annuals. It's a nursery that has for many years promoted small herbaceous plants and very unusual plants and grows them in quantity, native plants as well as non-native. And suddenly they've closed.
Dear.
And maybe by the time this airs, a buyer will be found. But it's a shocking, and that's I think the number one choice of anywhere in where I am in Northern California to go buy plants because it's such a great selection. And it's actually the nursery trade is in a bit of a crisis. The number of nurseries are closing. They can't. The pressure on the land price is going up. The developers are saying, you have 15 acres of land here. One of the most well-regarded one in California is San Marcos Growers. Randy Baldwin owns that for many years, and actually his website, the San Marcos website, is one of my go-to sources for information.
It's very good. I've used that for information for sure.
But his property has been rezoned, and so they're closing. They had their I was fortunately being here in Portugal. I missed their last going out of business bash party. They're not closing quite yet, but they had a party for the trade and friends last weekend. I missed that, so that's closing.
Oh dear, that's sad.
Another large nursery, Suncrest Nursery in Watsonville, has closed. And what's going to happen, what seems to be happening, is the larger nursery trades, the really large ones, are only growing a limited plant palette, and so that's going to limit, sadly, what gardeners have a choice for. When the designers don't have choices, then those who want gardens that are not professional gardeners or avid gardeners, they have no other place to go. There's still small nurseries. Native Plant Society has nurseries. Some of the botanic gardens propagate plants from their collection that are useful. But on a large scale, I'm concerned, literally, that the gardens will be limited to a plant palette that won't be interesting.
I suppose it might open doors for small specialist nurseries, perhaps, who often find it a struggle. Maybe opportunities for them.
I hope so, but I think they will be small. I mean, the mid-level nurseries that can grow hundreds of plants and supply the trade are going out of business. The very small ones, I think, will hopefully always have a small grower, a small shop, a mom and pop type place, and they'll grow enough to keep their livelihood, but they won't be well known beyond their immediate circle of friends. And I'm concerned that as the climate changes, we do need a new palette. Which actually brings up the University of California, Davis is doing. That's one of my favorite places to go. I should have mentioned that earlier. I've been photographing their gardens ever since I learned about summer dry climates for 25 years, because they have gardens there that have been promoting that. And they have, it's an agricultural school. It also has a horticultural school. And so they are actively researching plants. They have a program called Climate Ready Plants. And they're, for instance, bringing in oak trees from Texas and southern U.S. into California, so they'll be climate ready as the climate changes.
Right.
And
Oh,
so,
that's interesting. Very forward looking. Gosh,
yes.
Rare to have that.
And they have a nice nursery.
Yes.
And so they have a really great plant selection. And so those sort of institutions, I think, will have the information. Whether or not the industry latches onto it is yet to be seen.
Yes. Back to your work as a photographer, I know conversations I've had with garden photographers sometimes is that, they're expected to show a kind of perfection. In my experience in publishing, is art editors have very much been the key people, and art editors are often not gardeners, and they have this image, and they want to sell books or magazines on the strength of beautiful pictures. So inevitably you're driven towards perhaps a rather distorted view of gardens, that you're not showing the garden perhaps as the owner or designer sees it. Is that a tension that you feel?
Not at the least, actually.
No, really? That's interesting.
No,
it's very interesting.
I enjoy my favorite gardens experience are of garden owners and designers, and going into their garden and showing them angles they have not seen.
Yes, that
is such a challenge.
Yes,
But everyone is different. Over the years, I've given workshops on garden photography, and at one time the student said, "Oh, I loved your workshop, but don't you realize you're training the competition?"
Yeah.
And I said, "No, I have no competition."
No.
I mean, I'm not. There are any number of wonderful garden photographers who I admire, and I think do a better job than I do oftentimes. But it's different. I have a different look. I look at it how I like to see a garden, and if I can help you see it, wonderful. But it's not going to be the same. And in every workshop, there's always a student or two who does photographs that I would love to have taken.
Wow.
So we're all different. But I think you're going back to the idea of romanticizing the garden, of what it really should look like, and that's sort of our job in general in marketing, whether it's photography or writing, illustration. We want to show something sort of idealized.
Yes.
We wouldn't show a Japanese cherry blossom in the winter.
No,
maybe you would occasionally for the structure of the tree, but we're expected to see the cherry blossom. That may last for 2 weeks, so the photographer needs to be there during that time. And in the spring, when the flowers are at their peak and the shrubs have their fresh foliage, that's when the audience expects to see a garden. I love being in gardens at that time, but as a gardener myself, I enjoy the challenge of going in off season. In fact, I'm considering a book proposal with a woman, Carol Bornstein, who's one of the leading native plant experts in California, doing a book about native plants in the off season to show them the structure of the bark, the berries, this is what plant people and gardeners, real gardeners, really love about gardening, are the plants and how they look throughout a season. Designers tend to have a romanticized look, which is lovely. I love seeing them, but I love seeing how plants combine, and I hope it's interesting how showing a photograph in a publication legitimizes that look. Suddenly, it must be good if it's in the book, and so I've tried to use the term changing the aesthetic of what we expect to see in a garden photograph. Because once you deal with a publisher or a writer who's sympathetic, you can show a photograph that might be a bit unexpected, but with a good caption and a good reference, I see why they use that picture. Isn't it remarkable? And the aesthetic has to change, especially using in our climate with California native plants. The look can be a bit rough out in the wild, but when you bring it in the garden and you manicure things and you prune and you combine plants in an interesting way, they're beautiful. But it may not be typically beautiful. And so that's my job, literally, is to make it look beautiful in unexpected ways.
That's very interesting, because I've always said this about Pete Adolf, and in fact, that sort of, I suppose, late 1980s, when people like Henk Gerritsen were making gardens and just full of seed heads, they were letting their vegetables run to seed. And there was a Dutch photographer, Marieke Herf, who was photographing these and
seeds and things.
Sort of selling them into Dutch magazines. And then, Pete Adolf made a great thing of perennials with good structure and all those hoarfrost on seed heads, which
Yes.
happens a lot in
But
that
it is
Dutch
lovely.
climate. And that really so changed things around, because
Yes.
until then herbaceous plants was generally sort of cut down in the autumn, which and then people it gave people a whole new dimension of gardening. It made November in the garden a possibly attractive prospect, which in
Yes.
the past would have been anywhere in Northern Europe, quite unthinkable. November is when you sit inside and read your seed catalogues, and it just shows that, and that what perhaps gives me hope about the Mediterranean zone, where traditionally people are not very positive about nature and wild landscapes are not appreciated, and that's what we've got to do here is turn people on to sort of maybe a stylized natural beauty, but looking at plants out of season. And
Well, that's part of your job.
Role, yes, that is a role that we in garden media can do, and photographers play a crucial role here. Photography can change culture. I think it's a very important message.
Why I really enjoy working with authoritative writers who know what they're doing, because that validates the photograph.
Yes,
If a writer says this is a wonderful combination, and you see a photograph, the photograph by itself perhaps might grab your eye until you realize, the complex tapestry of colors and shapes are making it work.
Yes.
I was surprised, pleasantly surprised. We drove here to Porto, where we are now, from the Douro Valley yesterday, and drove a back road and went through a pine forest that was underlaid with ferns that were turning brown. Bracken of some kind. And it was wild, but the color of the bracken was cinnamon. It wasn't dead brown. It was cinnamon color. And there were some native grasses popping up here and there, and a bit early, some heathers happening, and I believe there's a yellow wildflower you mentioned to me last night what it was, but that tapestry of native plants in context of the trees and the photographers framing it just as so makes it attractive.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Especially if you're told, if the media says this is attractive, people who are not attuned to that might study it and say, this is this is something I'll look at more closely.
Right. Amongst the sort of younger generation of garden photographers in the States, who do you rate?
I don't know many younger photographers. I know internationally.
Internationally.
Claire Takas, I admire her work quite a bit. And her use of light as she captures gardens in good light.
Yes.
In California, there's a woman, Caitlin Atkinson, who's doing good work. I know she was a protege of a contemporary of mine, Marion Brenner, who's a wonderful garden photographer who's somewhat retired. I have an older generation of people that I always can admire, and there are a number of great British photographers who I follow and see their work. As far as American, sadly, I don't think of any. I almost hate to admit, I don't subscribe to any garden publications, except for the American Horticulture magazine, but that's more of authoritative. But I find I'm not interested in what they publish. It doesn't appeal to me. So I have no reason, and I'm not looking for business. So I don't need to know who the editors are and who the new writers of. It sounds a bit uppity for me to say that, I suppose, but it just doesn't interest me.
No,
so,
sure.
I'd much rather work with the summer dry people and some of the academics and the designers that I, have meet through that project.
Yeah. And what do you grow yourself in your own garden?
It's wonderful you asked that question, actually. I've been gardening at this site for 25, 26 years.
Oh,
it's finally come to a point where it's not totally mature, but it's interesting. And I was at a lecture. I have a good garden writer friend, Amy Stewart, who's just come up with a new book about trees. It's called The Tree Collectors. And it's about people who've collected trees. And I was at her book presentation, and she asked the audience, who among you collect trees in any sort of way? And I had to think of, I collect trees for fall color. And I planted my entire front yard for fall color. And in California, that's unexpected. But I've learned over the years, I've seen it. I've seen color. And so I planted my whole front yard for fall color. Now it's mature. Ginkgo trees, pistache trees, one of the most surprising one is the Tupelo Nyssa sylvatica. It has fantastic fall color.
Yes.
And they're all large enough now, so they made a presence. And I have a large hedge of Comiga sazanqua, which transitions sharply to a hedge of Arctostaphylos manzanita, which is the native California shrub. I have them side by side in the garden, and one gets summer water and irrigation, the other does not. But it's just a interesting budding together. I have that. I have a number of native plants in the back that I have shrubs, particularly. I like shrubs. And I have a small collection of species rhododendrons. When I did that very first book I mentioned years ago with the ortho, I traveled to Seattle, Washington to the Rhododendron Species Foundation and discovered fragrant rhododendrons, and that we can actually grow them in California. It's a bit of a guilty pleasure because they require more water than anything else in the garden, but they don't require deep water, really. They survive with shallow water.
Yeah, quite superficial root systems.
So I have some of those. They've suffered from the Phytophthora crisis we have in California, sudden oak death. There's a Phytophthora ramorum that's killing oak trees and Lithodoris and any number of plants, and it has affected my own rhododendrons. But the garden is always changing. It's
How big is it?
Well, we have 3 acres of land.
Nice.
It's on a hill, and the upper 2 acres are not gardened. It's fortunately it's fenced. The previous owners had horses; they had fenced it, and so that's kept the deer out of it. And so we have a nice succession of native wildflowers on the hill behind us. And the acre where we live is dominated by mature oak trees. The native red oaks, live oaks, and valley oaks. Very large ones. And so we have great high shade because of it.
Oh wow!
There's a lot of plants we can do. As I learned with gardening, shade is a very misunderstood term sometimes. Deep shade is one thing, but high shade is wonderful. We're in a very hot, we're in County, California. It's just literally right now, I've just heard from friends, it's been over 100 degrees for 4 or 5 days. Here's early October. Not unheard of, but still difficult to garden. And when you have high shade, it changes what you can do a lot. So I'm still learning.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Saxon. That was all really good to speak with you. And, we'll look forward perhaps to hearing more about the Summer Dry project. I mean, this is something we at Garden Masterclass will be, as a subject we return to again and again. So thank you very much.
Yeah.